He felt something break inside him the day he realized, as the story has been told, that he could no longer provide for his family the way he had always imagined. The move into the housing projects was for him a quiet humiliation. Diana's mother reportedly saw it differently. She looked at the same cramped rooms and concrete courtyards and called it a fresh start. Two people, one addressed completely different emotional weather. Years later, when Diana Ross speaks about family, she often returns to one idea. "I give them a lot of love and a lot of attention," she has said. When she is with her children, she insists she is truly there. Not half present, not distracted by headlines, managers, or the past. Fully locked in. And yet, at 81, even as she stands beneath stage lights, wrapped in sequins, collecting standing ovations and lifetime achievement trophies, a question hangs in the air that almost no one dares to voice. What if survival itself is the saddest part of her legend? What if the real tragedy hiding beneath the gowns, the practiced smile and the hits that never leave radio, is a life bent by pressure, secrecy, and choices that never completely belonged to her, a life shaped by institutions that studied her, refined her, and then claimed her? This is the story of a teenage girl pulled out of Detroit and fed into a machine that managed her voice, her posture, her hair, even how her skin should appear under certain lights. It is also the story of decades of speculation she was never really allowed to answer. Diana Ross did not simply climb her way to stardom. She was carved into it. Careers were constructed around her image. Other careers withered in her shadow. While the world lifted her name to mythic status, the price was tallied in private, in narrow dressing rooms, under unforgiving spotlights, in contracts that locked in decisions she would spend years absorbing. This is not a celebration. It is a meticulous examination. In this investigation, we are not here to praise Diana Ross. We are here to examine what was taken from her increment by increment, while the cameras rolled and the applause never stopped. Chapter 1. Detroit 1944, 1963 Poverty Pressure, and the Cruel Audition. Before Diana Ross became a brand name, before wardrobe changes, record-breaking chart runs, and magazine covers, there was simply a girl born on March 26, 1944, in Detroit, Michigan, to a working-class black family trying to survive a city that promised opportunity, but rationed respect. Post-war Detroit roared with assembly lines and clanged metal, but it also enforced invisible boundaries. Black neighborhoods were hemmed in by redlining, unwritten codes, and economic ceilings. Jobs existed, but advancement came with conditions, and every condition left its own mark. In that environment, Diana learned early that composure could mean protection. Her childhood moved through small shared apartments and overfilled classrooms. Space was limited. Privacy was rare. Teachers took notice not because she shouted above everyone else, but because she didn't. Church members observed the same thing. She wasn't the loudest voice in the choir, nor the most technically powerful. What stood out was control. She could stand perfectly still where others swayed. She maintained eye contact without open challenge. She learned to read rooms in a city where being seen at the wrong moment could invite trouble. To be understandable but not threatening became a talent in itself. Music arrived through school programs, church gatherings, and local talent shows. By her early teens, Diana and her friends rehearsed anywhere they could claim a few square feet basements that smelled of concrete and dust, living rooms with furniture pushed against the walls, borrowed community halls that hummed with fluorescent lights. The melodies mattered, but the appearance mattered just as much. Detroit teens knew the story that floated up and down West Grand Boulevard. There was a new company in town, Motown, looking for black performers they could polish for national radio and television. Motown was not just another label. It was a gate. And gates are there to decide who is allowed through. When Diana joined the teenage group that would become the Supremes, the first auditions did not feel like talent showcases. They felt like inspections. There were folding chairs lined up against the wall, men with clipboards, and eyes that tracked posture as carefully as pitch. Voices could be trained, they believed. Images had to be selected. This is where the first uncomfortable pattern appears. According to people who were present in those early days, the real question was never simply who sings the best, it was who can be sold the furthest. That cold calculation pointed toward Diana. Industry recollections describe how Berry Gordy took notice of her quickly, not because she outsang everyone else, many agreed she did not, but because she photographed cleanly, could be coached to move with exactness, and could receive the camera's gaze without shrinking or challenging it. Motown's philosophy was blunt. Crossover success required polish, and polish required total control. Training escalated behind closed doors. There were vocal rehearsals, yes, but also what amounted to finishing school, how to walk into a room, how to sit on a talk show couch, where to place your hands during silence, how wide to smile when meeting executives. Performers were corrected mid-song to adjust their stance or expression. Stories from that era, rarely written down, often passed quietly from person to person, describe private coaching sessions where a dress hem was raised or lowered by an inch, a shade of lipstick, softened a hairstyle, modified a smile, practiced again and again, until it landed exactly where the label wanted it. Whether every small detail is accurate matters less than what they collectively reveal. The body was part of the product. Then comes the detail that would later ignite decades of debate. Motown frequently prioritized face over voice. Lead parts began to drift. Harmonies tilted gently toward Diana. These shifts did not happen in a single meeting or with a dramatic announcement. They crept in over months and then years, tiny adjustments that gradually hardened into structure. By the time anyone felt ready to object, the hierarchy was already baked into schedules, publicity plans, and contracts. Inside the group, tension began to swell. Other members saw the center position gravitate toward Diana. Microphones and camera angles started to favor her. Interviewers directed most questions her way. No one pointed a finger at her outright. The real power was not technically hers, at least not yet. But the effect was identical. Silence became a survival tactic. Speak up and risk being labeled a problem. Stay quiet and hope that the rising tide of success might protect you. The lessons from Detroit echoed through Motown's halls. Outside the studio, segregation shrank the horizon of what was possible. Inside, the pressure was surgical and precise. Black performers were being prepared for white audiences' living rooms. That meant smoothing out edges, adjusting sound, softening speech, refining posture, reshaping hair. For Diana, it meant hearing sometimes gently and sometimes sharply that stillness was safer than power, and that control would be rewarded if she did not demand too much freedom with it. Rumors circulated around the building that Berry Gordy's focus on her came with an unspoken set of expectations, that mentorship blurred into influence, that closeness to the boss brought protection but also obligations. None of that appeared in official paperwork. It did not have to. It was communicated in glances, in who was invited into which room, and in whose calls were returned. In the early 1960s, a teenage girl did not sit across the table and negotiate her terms. She learned them by watching which faces simply stopped appearing at rehearsals. By 1962, the machine had made its choice. Diana's name inched forward. Publicity photos moved her by degrees into the center. Magazine blurbs began to present her as the face of the group. Contracts, according to later accounts, reflected that shift. Detroit, the city that had raised her, the blocks that taught her caution, faded behind endless practice sessions, etiquette lessons, and rules that allowed no rest. School yielded to travel itineraries. Childhood friends were replaced by handlers, chaperones, and staff. The trade-off was made with shocking speed, personal freedom exchanged for access, unfiltered voice exchanged for worldwide visibility. Diana became adept at absorbing correction without complaint. People who knew her at the time remember a young woman who rarely voiced her frustration, not because she felt no strain, but because she understood what was at risk. Being chosen meant being watched. Being watched meant being careful. Here is where future tragedies take root. The habit of swallowing discomfort. The acceptance of image as a shield even when it cuts. The belief that saying less will keep you safe. From the cold streets of Detroit to the polished floors of Motown, the message stayed the same: once the system selects you, you no longer fully belong to yourself. By 1963, the Supremes stood on the edge of national breakout. The decision had already been made. Diana was positioned at the front, flawless, composed, self-contained. The curtain was about to rise. The applause was inevitable. So were the consequences. The applause did not arrive softly. It crashed over them in a single season and never really receded. In January 1964, while winter still clung stubbornly to Detroit, Diana Ross stepped onto national television with a strange, heavy awareness. Something was different now. Motown's experiment had worked. The Supremes were no longer just another promising girl group. They had become an event. And events are not guided. They are managed. On January 13, 1964, Where Did Our Love Go hit #1. Within weeks, booking requests poured into West Grand Boulevard like floodwater. The group's calendar hardened into a grid of rehearsals, flights, tapings, hotel check-ins, and quick changes. Success demanded choreography far beyond the stage. Every entrance was timed. Every answer to every question was rehearsed. Every smile had a purpose. What the public labeled elegance was behind the curtain relentless pressure. Inside the group, the internal order shifted almost immediately. During early 1964 rehearsals, staffers began to rearrange microphones, camera placements, and blocking for television appearances. Tiny adjustments at first, easy to ignore, easier to excuse. But they repeated. At sound checks, Diana's microphone was tested first. During interviews, the host's gaze and questions drifted toward her, as if pulled by gravity. By the spring of 1964, she stood in the center by default. No memo announced the change. It was executed in offices, in quiet conversations, in directive phone calls. The reasoning, according to insiders, was brutally straightforward. Berry Gordy, it was said, believed that Diana's composure, her ability to hold herself still and precise, translated best into white America's living rooms. Under harsh studio lights, she photographed in a way executives deemed safe. She moved with restraint, never spilling over the edges of the frame. The calculation was commercial, not purely artistic. The label chose a face, then slowly rearranged the narrative to justify that choice. That decision carved directly into Florence Ballard's fate. Among musicians, and those close to the group, Florence was widely regarded as the powerhouse voice, the one whose raw tone could shake a room. But the squeeze did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived in fragments. One less lead vocal here. A shorter speaking segment there. A meeting held without her. By the end of 1964, unease had set in. So had changes in her body. Her weight went up and down under strain. Management described these shifts as professional concerns. The phrase seemed neutral. It quickly became ammunition. In 1965, the schedule intensified further. Tours stretched into punishing rooms. Travel blurred days into each other. Staff notes from that period describe late-night rehearsals where criticism targeted Florence's stamina and appearance with growing intensity. Feedback came in the language of business, but it landed on her skin and her psyche. When she faltered, there were no safety measures, only consequences. The machine did not slow for anyone's pain. That same year, whispers solidified into rumors about new closed-door meetings, where contracts, according to later accounts, were quietly adjusted. Motown never released official documentation to confirm every detail, but former employees would go on to claim that royalty structures shifted even more heavily in Diana's direction. Authority narrowed to a single focal point. Decisions that had once belonged to the trio began to orbit one name. When Florence asked questions, when she pushed back, a label was applied: difficult. It stuck instantly. By February 1967, the fracture could no longer be hidden backstage. Florence began missing shows after collapsing under the weight of stress and exhaustion. Management moved with swift precision. Cindy Birdsong was brought in as a stand-in, then, without ceremony, as a permanent replacement. The reason offered to the public was reliability. The reality was removal. Florence's wardrobe was cleared from dressing rooms. Her access badge stopped working in certain spaces. The act carried on without missing a beat. Then came the quiet earthquake of July 1967. New promotional materials appeared. The name had changed. Diana Ross and the Supremes. No press conference. No explanation. No official goodbye. In one printed line, history was revised while everyone was still living through it. Power was no longer distributed. It was officially crowned. Backstage reports from that summer paint a picture of cold efficiency. Meetings were short. Orders were clear. Those whose careers improved kept their heads down. Those whose careers vanished had already lost their seats at the table. The machine rewarded compliance and erased resistance. Diana's silence became central to the story, not because she personally authored every decision, but because her elevated position required agreement. People close to her later recalled that she understood the damage unfolding around her and felt locked in place by contracts, loyalty, and fear. Success had become a kind of gilded confinement. While one trajectory shot upward, another spiraled out of sight. Florence Ballard's life cracked in the shadows. By 1968, financial problems surrounded her. Her health declined. Attempts to restart her career were met with indifference or stalled by closed doors. Friends recalled deepening depression and isolation. The same system that once depended on her voice offered nothing once she was no longer considered an asset. On February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died, at the age of 32, reportedly impoverished. The news did not create the impact it should have at first. It landed slowly, then exploded across time. Fans began to look back on the triumph of the Supremes with a new lens, one clouded by grief and suspicion. The questions that rose had no satisfying answers. Who tried to intervene? Who had the power to? Who decided it was safer not to? For Diana Ross, the crown now carried a permanent stain. Every award, every glowing profile, every standing ovation arrived with an invisible footnote. Admiration was fused to doubt. The public's curiosity twisted into suspicion. Did she know how bad things had become for Florence? Did she attempt to help? Or had the machinery surrounding her stripped away any real say long before those choices were on the table? The most unsettling version of the truth lies in the middle, that power can surround a person without fully belonging to them, and that silence can be enforced without a single explicit threat spoken aloud. Between 1964 and 1969, the Supremes reshaped American pop culture. They shattered ceilings, crossed color lines, and redefined what a black girl group could be on the world stage. But the burden of that breakthrough was distributed unevenly. Motown's most dazzling victory threw a long shadow one that followed its brightest star wherever she went. Once success demanded sacrifice, the system chose who would be shielded and who would be left exposed. That shadow did not disappear when the group's run ended. It hardened into a permanent question that trailed Diana Ross through the decades. Not whether she won, but what the win required. When Diana Ross walked away from the Supremes in early 1970, the story was marketed as liberation, a woman stepping out from a group, a star finally claiming her own name. Magazine covers framed it as empowerment. Talk shows repeated the same line. But the moment she crossed fully into Hollywood, that freedom narrowed into something sharper and far more dangerous. On this side of the industry, there were no harmonies, no matching gowns, no other voices to absorb attention. There was only her face blown up on screens, frozen in still images examined frame by people she would never meet. Her first stretch in Los Angeles felt disorienting. The city moved faster than Detroit and somehow felt colder. Studios hummed with machinery and traditions that had been built for white skin, white lighting standards, white beauty assumptions, white norms layered into film stock, and camera tests long before Diana ever stepped onto a soundstage. The technology did not just capture. It corrected. And every correction demanded a price. During early screen tests for Lady Sings, The Blues in February 1972, technicians circled Diana adjusting and readjusting the lights like she was a technical issue, not a person. One assistant director was said to have muttered about hotspots on camera. Another quietly recommended changes to her makeup. None of it was delivered as an insult. That was part of the horror. The system spoke in calm, neutral tones while insisting she adapt. By the time filming actually began, the schedule left almost no room for the body to recover. 12-hour days. Take after take under punishing lamps. Foundation and powder layered on, removed and reapplied until her skin had no chance to breathe. Between scenes, makeup artists pressed sponges into already sensitive skin, moving quickly to stay on time. Off camera, the names of dermatologists started circulating among leading actresses like a separate secret contact list. These visits were not described as scandalous, but as routine maintenance. Procedures were presented as small, temporary, manageable. That is where the quiet speculation began. According to people who later claimed proximity to those productions, light chemical resurfacing treatments were sometimes scheduled between shoot days, timed to smooth texture and even tone for film stock that at the time refused to handle darker skin fairly. No one used the word bleaching in official spaces. Nothing was put into writing. Appointments happened privately, often late at night, with the hope that any redness or swelling would calm by morning. Hope does not always match what the mirror reflects. By late 1973, during fittings and camera tests, for mahogany crew members reportedly noticed persistent redness along Diana's cheekbones and jawline. One stylist suggested postponing a test, worried about how it would read under the lights. The answer came back fast and final. The date stayed. The shoot went ahead. The assumption was simple: makeup could hide irritation, lighting could disguise the rest. That choice did not exist in isolation. It echoed going forward. As the 1970s unfolded, Diana's image appeared to shift subtly, at first across films, television specials, and magazine covers. Fans noticed before critics did. Conversations began quietly in living rooms and beauty salons, then grew louder. By 1975, editors were reportedly receiving letters that asked why she looked different from one cover to the next. Publicists answered with a rotating set of explanations. It was the lighting, they said, or the specific film stock, or retouching by overzealous art departments. Each explanation contradicted the last. The lack of a clear, consistent story only fueled speculation. Inside the industry, the reality was more mechanical than mysterious. By then, Diana Ross was considered a high-stakes investment. Productions could not afford to halt. Contracts did not pause to accommodate healing. When her skin became more reactive, the response was not to slow down. It was to adjust everything around her. Filters were introduced. Shooting windows were narrowed. Light levels were brought down by small increments, barely visible to viewers, but crucial to the person standing under the lamps. According to those who worked on sets with her by 1977, sensitivity to bright light had become part of the routine. Between takes, Diana would shield her eyes or blink against the glare. Crew members quietly adapted and carried on. No one wanted to be the one to hold up production. Then the conversation left the studio walls. By 1979, radio hosts and columnists were openly debating colorism, pointing to Diana as an example without asking for her consent. Was she, as some people claimed, changing herself to satisfy Hollywood standards? Or was she being pushed into that corner by a system that had made darker skin an inconvenience for decades? The argument hardened into accusation. Each photo, each appearance became proof for whichever side wanted to claim her. The person was swallowed by the discourse. Diana became a symbol more than a human being. She did not issue a direct rebuttal. She had learned long before Hollywood that explanations invite interrogation, and interrogation rarely ends fairly for black women in entertainment. Silence, while painful, remained the least destructive of several bad options. But silence came with its own cost. It allowed everyone else to narrate her body for her. The most chilling detail from this period is not a single alleged treatment or one dramatic incident. It is how little time was afforded for consequences to unfold. According to multiple insiders, there were days when irritation had not fully calmed before cameras rolled again. Redness was covered. Tenderness was ignored. The expectation was that professionalism meant endurance. Hollywood rewarded those who absorbed damage quietly and kept working. By 1981, during a major televised performance, lighting technicians reportedly adjusted intensity mid-song after noticing signs of discomfort. Viewers at home saw only a seamless, glamorous broadcast. The people in the control room understood what it took to deliver that illusion. This was no longer treated as crisis. It was simply how things were done. What began as technical adjustments solidified into a permanent kind of scrutiny. Diana Ross was not merely acting in films and singing on stages during these years. She was placed at the center of a wider cultural battle over black beauty assimilation and survival under white-dominated standards. The industry that built and enforced those standards never truly stood trial. The woman who carried them on her skin did. By 1982, the pattern was fully established. Every new photo would be held up against an older one. Every appearance would reignite the same questions. Hollywood's focus drifted to newer faces and fresher stars. Diana, however, remained under the weight of all that lingering speculation. The tragedy of this chapter is not contained in one rumored procedure or one controversial image. It lives in the collision of deadlines and prejudice of technology designed for one kind of body and used on another. Film demanded consistency. Human skin does not offer that. And so the system moved forward regardless, confident that image, a flattened, curated version of reality, could absorb what the body could not. This was not a chapter with a clean ending. It was the opening of a wound that never fully closed. The rooms were never truly quiet, even when the doors were shut and the music had stopped. By the early 1970s, Diana Ross had stepped out of Motown's tightly controlled corridors and into Hollywood's sprawling maze, where power no longer announced itself only through contracts and office titles. It arrived as late-night invitations, discreet phone calls, and private dinners after shows. And it almost always arrived with strings attached. In public, the official narrative was simple independence. She was presented as a solo star, a leading lady, a woman steering her own destiny. But behind that script, according to people who worked close to her back then, the range of actual choices was shrinking, not expanding. Relationships were shaped not just by emotion, but by proximity to the people who could quietly decide who stayed visible and who faded. In this world, finance, casting, and distribution were tangled together. Romance and leverage often shared the same table. One connection, heavily reported, endlessly debated, and never fully clarified, sat at the center of this era: Diana Ross's long-rumored relationship with Berry Gordy. Insiders have described a bond that went beyond contracts and studio schedules, a connection that built careers while also restricting what could be said out loud. The timing was crucial. As Diana chased film roles, television specials, and a broader brand, Motown's influence did not evaporate. It traveled with her like a shadow. Protection came bundled with expectations. Silence arrived as part of the security package. Then Hollywood added its own layer. After premieres, parties migrated from ballrooms to hotel suites. In those smaller rooms, decisions were made about future albums, movie roles, and promotional campaigns. Agents, producers, and executives discussed trajectories over glasses and hushed conversations. According to contemporaneous accounts, Diana would often be there in person while these plans were drawn up, yet not as the main decision-maker. She was the subject being discussed, not the one holding the pen. One moment from late 1975 has been frequently cited by staffers who claim to have seen it unfold. After a sold-out Los Angeles show, the celebration shifted upstairs. At some point, the mood turned from congratulation to negotiation. A film shoot date collided with a tour commitment. Someone proposed a compromise that placed the physical and emotional costs squarely on Diana, demanding more work, less rest, tighter margins. The room agreed. She nodded. On paper, it was consensus. In practice, it was pressure disguised as cooperation. This is how control operated: subtle, collaborative, furnished with smiles instead of threats. Rumors began to crystallize around the idea of don't-ask arrangements. Not legal documents filed in court, but unspoken agreements enforced by access. Speak out publicly and risk losing momentum. Cooperate quietly and the machine would keep moving in your favor. In an era before widespread conversations about power imbalances and exploitation, this dynamic was treated as normal. The industry called it professionalism. Reporters called it discretion. The scandals that followed did not explode all at once. They seeped out slowly. Tabloids fed the public a steady stream of insinuations about affairs with men who controlled budget studio schedules or magazine covers. Each new rumor forced a calculation. Deny it and invite more attention. Confirm anything and risk professional fallout. Say nothing and be accused anyway. Silence was not a shield. It was simply the least dangerous weapon available. A particularly vicious wave of speculation hit in 1978 when a columnist implied without proof that Diana's continued access to high-level projects was owed less to talent and more to personal entanglements with powerful men. The claim went unsubstantiated and unpunished. For Diana, it left another scar. From that point on, every success she earned had to fight through a haze of suspicion. Every project she turned down, every boundary she tried to draw was interpreted as evidence of some unseen trade. What fans rarely saw were the private costs. According to people who say they were close to her at the time, Diana began to live in constant alert. Words were chosen like glass, carefully, painfully. She avoided unscripted interviews that promised honesty, but usually delivered traps. She declined opportunities that seemed designed to corner her into confessions. The damage built up quietly. Relationships were strained by the pressure of secrecy. Trust became thin and hard to maintain. Her inner circle shrank. In 1980, while preparing a major televised special, a creative clash broke the surface. Diana pushed back against staging decisions that, in her view, magnified the scrutiny already swirling around her personal life. She wanted some control over what the cameras suggested. That resistance was noted. Later, when scheduling snags emerged, the willingness to accommodate her seemed limited. The lesson was delivered without anyone spelling it out: cooperation keeps the doors open. Push too hard and the room turns cold. Here is where the tragedy becomes razor sharp. Every time Diana chose to say less, audiences insisted on hearing more. Silence was framed as scheming, guilt, or manipulation. Few stopped to ask whether silence was in fact enforced by economic reality. Few wanted to consider what it would mean for a black woman, whose success underpinned entire companies, to openly challenge the machinery that fed off her image. The cruelest truth is that her agency during this period was both real and heavily constrained. She could select outfits, refine performances, make artistic suggestions. But she could not easily choose to disrupt the network of men, money, and institutions that depended on her compliance to keep operating smoothly. Power flowed around her like a river in flood season. She stood in the center, but that did not mean she controlled the current. By 1982, the pattern had hardened into routine. The same scandals were revisited under new headlines. The same whispers were recycled with minor edits. The industry continued to benefit from Diana Ross's name, her labor, her myth, while stepping back from any responsibility for the moral fog surrounding her. She remained highly visible and strategically voiceless. And so one question lingered, growing heavier as the years passed. How much refusal is truly possible when refusing threatens not just your career, but the livelihoods of everyone tied to your success? For Diana Ross, love, leverage, and work collided in rooms the public never saw, where choices were rarely simple, yes or no decisions. Every silence was later used as evidence against her. Every act of endurance was rewritten as intention. In a system that worships access and prizes secrecy, the cost of speaking out can be higher than the cost of enduring in silence. And when the outside world misunderstands that endurance, it becomes yet another accusation to answer for the rest of a life spent under watch. The curtain still goes up. That more than anything is what makes this final chapter so hard to look at directly. Diana Ross is not a ghost or a legend carved in marble. She is alive, present, and still working. She walks out onto stages, hears real applause, feels real lights on her skin. And yet every entrance now feels like a new hearing in a trial that never ends. The audience stands, cameras flash, and within minutes, judgment appears on screens in comment sections inside headlines, written by people who were not there. In an age where nothing really disappears and everything can be replayed, simply surviving is no longer a shield. It is another point of exposure. In the 2020s, Diana Ross keeps performing not because she has to sing to survive, but because the stage is still the one place where her story briefly matches her intent. There, for a few hours, she decides which songs are sung and how they are framed. But the moment she steps off stage, the narrative fractures. Every photo is zoomed in. Every video clip is pulled apart and repurposed. Social media freezes her face in the middle of a laugh or a blink and demands explanations for every angle. Is she too altered? Is she refusing to age properly? Is she hiding something? The questions stack up because the unwritten rules are brutally simple. She is not allowed to be old. The scrutiny sharpened around a series of high-profile appearances in recent years. One harshly lit photo taken from the wrong angle, at the wrong second, spread faster than any context attached to it. Comment threads filled with accusations, recycled versions of old suspicions, and new insults dressed up as concern. Debates over colorism reignited. Long-standing rumors were reheated and served again as if they were new discoveries. The unresolved past returned not as reflection, but as prosecution. What changed is not the woman at the center of the frame. It is the size and shape of the courtroom. Algorithms reward outrage. Subtlety and context do not travel. So every time Diana appears, it becomes another public referendum on her life, her choices, and a body conducted by strangers who consider themselves entitled to a verdict. When she smiles through it, the smile is labeled a mask, a dodge. When she says nothing, the silence is framed as guilt. When she speaks about legacy, gratitude, or endurance, some people demand a different kind of speech, confessions they believe they are owed. Any explanation is treated as an admission. Any refusal to explain is read as proof. There is no answer that can close the case. The cruelty intensifies around aging itself. Time on her face is treated as a failure, not a fact. Lines are circled and enlarged. The way she moves is analyzed as if it were evidence. Any vocal strain becomes proof of decline. And in the public imagination, decline now requires accountability. Icons are expected to be timeless yet punished if they appear to be fighting time at all. When Diana steps back from the spotlight, she is accused of hiding. When she steps forward, she is accused of pretending nothing has changed. Recent conversations have reopened scars that never healed. Commentators revisit the Supremes, years peeling apart old footage, as if they have uncovered something no one noticed before, ignoring decades of discussion and context. Others dig into her Hollywood era, isolating still frames and crafting elaborate narratives, without addressing the technology prejudice or contractual pressure surrounding those images. The system that designed those conditions remains largely unnamed. The woman who survived them is asked to answer for all of it. Then comes the demand for a final explanation, calls for Diana to finally tell the truth. But whose version of the truth is being requested, on whose terms in this media economy? Confession rarely brings closure. It generates content. Anything she might say could be chopped into clips, repackaged, debated, and monetized by others. She appears to understand that very clearly. Silence, learned early in Detroit and refined at Motown and Hollywood, still looks like the least destructive option. Yet the price of that silence has never been higher. The harshest part of this phase is the absence of any real exit. Traditional scandals end with something: a statement, a settlement, a retreat from public life. Aging does not. There is no final act to time. The punishment renews with every birthday, every candid shot, every trending video. Her body becomes a living archive that strangers feel entitled to annotate and correct. Most observers do not consider the cumulative effect. Years of scrutiny seep into muscle memory, into posture, into the spaces between words. Diana's composure, her careful, measured presence, has often been mistaken for arrogance, coldness, or distance. In reality, it functions more like armor. When every sentence can be twisted and every expression can be used against you, stillness becomes a survival strategy. The industry that benefits from this controlled presence does little to absorb the fallout. Tributes are produced. Lifetime achievement ceremonies are staged. She is honored as an icon in abstract terms, while the person behind the title absorbs the backlash alone. Praise does not cancel out harm. It can amplify it by resetting expectations she is no longer physically able or humanly required to meet. There is also another quiet violation unfolding in real time: the theft of her authorship. Documentaries, think pieces, YouTube breakdowns, and social media threads recut Diana Ross's life into narratives told with an air of certainty she has never been allowed to safely claim for herself. Other people analyze her choices, assign motives, interpret her image, and divide her into eras they can argue about. Her legacy is edited in public, largely without her direct input. She becomes a character in stories she did not write, moved through scenes chosen for impact and engagement, rather than depth or truth. That is the paradox at the center of her later years. Diana Ross is visible almost everywhere and genuinely heard almost nowhere. She is asked to account for history while being denied the conditions needed to tell her story fully and without distortion. When she refuses interviews that promise vulnerability but are built for spectacle, critics call it avoidance. When she accepts ceremonial roles, they accuse her of managing her reputation. The maze is designed without a clean exit. This is why the last chapter of her life, as it stands now, feels less like a fall and more like a sentence. There is no dramatic collapse to mourn, no final scandal to close the book. There is only the ongoing reality of living under permanent observation, a life measured out in equal parts applause and accusation. A woman who is told she cannot age, cannot falter, cannot fully explain herself, because the minute she tries, her words will be taken, edited, and used to build a story that belongs to someone else. This is not a scandal waiting for resolution. It is a condition that persists, a crown that never comes off, a spotlight that never cools, an audience that will not leave the room. That may be the most devastating truth of all. As this story comes to a close, one conclusion cuts through everything. Diana Ross did not lose her life, but she did lose something just as irreversible: the simple, fundamental right to be seen first as a human being. From a girl chosen too early to an artist shaped by systems she did not design, to an elder judged for the crime of surviving longer than her critics, her tragedy is not a single mistake or one dark secret. It is a lifetime of being watched, interpreted, and sentenced by others. So the question is no longer whether Diana Ross made all the right choices. The real question is how many choices she ever truly controlled. Was her silence driven by fear or built from survival? Was her endurance a sign of extraordinary strength, or simply the last option left in a world that never offered her a safe alternative? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments. We'd like to explore their journey as well.